The respiratory system of rabbit. It includes a pair of lungs and an air tract which lead to it. The air passage consists of external nostrils, nasal cavity, internal nostrils, nasopharynx, glottis, larynx, trachea, bronchi. External nostrils or external nares open into the two nasal canals, which is separated by an internasal septum from the this is the oral cavity, this is the nasal cavity. They are separated by the palate. This is the palate. Internally, the nasal canal is lined by ciliated glandular olfactory epithelium. So, this is the external opening of the nose. This opens to a nasal cavity. It is separated from the oral cavity by a palate. The nasal cavity is lined by an olfactory epithelium, which is sensory and which has many glands which secrete mucus. Then it will open into the pharynx. This leads into the larynx. Larynx is the voice box. So the larynx is a complex structure which we'll see now. This is the larynx. It's a very complex structure. It is supported by 4 cartilages. That is the arytenoid cartilage, that is paired. Then there is thyroid and cricoid cartilage. So this is one single thyroid, single cricoid and a pair of arytenoid. That is how they have 4 cartilages which support the larynx. Connected to the apex of the arytenoid cartilage. This is the arytenoid cartilage and this is the apex or the tip. Is a small nodule-like cartilage called cartilage of Santorini. Stretching between the thyroid and the arytenoid are a pair of vocal cords. Okay, and the anterior ones are false vocal cords and the posterior ones are true vocal cords. The larynx is essentially a mechanical valve at the entrance of the airway. It regulates the entry and exit of air. From the larynx leads the long tubular trachea or windpipe, which lies above the esophagus. So, this is the structure of the larynx and trachea. So, this is a complex larynx which has cartilages which are called thyroid, cricoid and arytenoid. In arytenoid, there is a cartilage of Santorini and there is a vocal cords which are attached to the thyroid and the arytenoid cartilage, which serves as a vocal cord. So, there are false vocal cords and true vocal cords. And from the larynx, there is the trachea, which is supported by incomplete cartilaginous. This is the cartilaginous rods, which are incomplete. You can see that this is only half covering the trachea. It does not cover them entirely. So, this is called as the tracheal rings. They are lined. The trachea is lined internally by ciliated epithelium. The connective tissue layer of the trachea consists of mucus glands whose secretion helps in keeping the inner surface of the trachea very moist and slimy and also prevents the bacterial and dust particles from getting into the lungs. Trachea enters into the thoracic cavity and divides into 2 bronchi. So this is the cross section of the, this is a transverse section of the trachea, which consists of muscles, the cartilaginous rings, the mucous glands, which are seen in abundance. There is globulate cells and connective tissue and pseudostriated ciliated epithelium. That's how the structure of trachea is. And the trachea enters the thoracic cavity and divides into two bronchus. So this is one of the bronchus. There is another one which is also diverging from the trachea, and so that bronchus, which is arising from the trachea, it is supported by the cartilaginous half rings called bronchial rings. Then each bronchus passes into the lungs on each side. The trachea, bronchi and their branches are internally lined by ciliated mucous membrane. The lungs are seen lateral. Okay, so this is how the lungs are. This is the lungs. So this is how we have seen the trachea branching into bronchus, which leads into the lungs. And the lungs are situated in the thoracic cavity. They are covered by the bony framework formed dorsally by the vertebral column, ventrally by the sternum. It already studied about the sternum, which is seen as in the front, and the vertebral column, which supports the back, and from the vertebral column arises the ribs. So in turn it protects the, like this. So you have the vertebral column here, and this is the sternum here, right? And the ribs arise from this and will cover this region, so it will cause protection for the, like this. It will protect the lungs in the front. So that is how the arrangement is. So the lungs are situated in the thoracic cavity. It is covered by the ribs, and it is enclosed in a pleural sac that is formed of two pleural membrane, and it encloses a cavity called pleural cavity, which is filled with pleural fluid. The left, in between the left and right lung, you see this cavity, which will show you in another color. This is the cavity between the left and right lung. That is called as, that gap is called as mediastinum. That's very important, which is the place where the heart is located. This is the mediastinum, and that is where the heart is located. The lungs are lobular organs. The right lung, this is the right lung. This has 4 lobes, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and the left one has just 2 lobes, and the 4 lobes are anterior esophagus. Okay, then there is the right anterior, and there is the right posterior one, then the posterior esophagus. So these are the different kind of lobes that is seen in the right lung. The left lung has just 2 lobes, and it is called left anterior and left posterior. And each lobe contains a number of blind air sacs called atria or infundibula. Each infundibulum is formed of several air pockets called alveoli, which is a structural unit of lungs and center of gas exchange. So this is that is what is shown here. That is the different alveolar sacs. The wall of the lungs have complex air capillaries, blood capillaries, air capillaries. Air capillaries are formed by the repeated branching and rebranching of the bronchus. The bronchus enters the lungs and it is called primary bronchus, and it breaks into the secondary bronchi, which breaks into tertiary bronchi. Each tertiary bronchi opens into thin-walled bronchioles. These end in a ramifying or a network-like system of delicate thin-walled air capillaries called terminal bronchioles or respiratory bronchioles. From each of them arise several alveolar ducts. These end in alveoli of infundibula. So this is the arrangement of the blood vessels in alveoli, and this is the alveoli, that is the bronchioles. Primary bronchiole divides into secondary bronchiole. This branches into the tertiary, and it ends in number of alveoli. The mechanism of the breathing. The lungs are enclosed in airtight pleural chambers in the thoracic cavity. So any change in the volume of the thoracic and pleural cavity causes a change in lungs. When the thoracic cavity expands, the pleural cavity will enlarge and the lungs will dilate. The atmospheric air pushes the lungs, causing inspiration. And when the thorax contracts, the cavities will shrink, the lungs will get compressed, causing expiration. Respiratory movements which lead to expansion and contraction involve the movement of ribs and diaphragm, known as costal and abdominal breathing. This is the costal muscles, and also the abdominal muscles also help in breathing. During inspiration, what happens? The external intercostal muscles, that is muscle between the ribs and the muscles of the diaphragm contract. So ribs are drawn forward and sideward, and the arched diaphragm stays straight. The extension of the ribs carries the sternum forward and downward. So the movement of the ribs and sternum increases the thoracic cavity from side to side and from above downward, and the straightening of the diaphragm causes expansion from before backwards. When thoracic cavity expands in all these three dimensions, pleural cavity and lungs expand, creating a low pressure inside the lungs. This in turn causes rushing in of air into the lungs. During expiration, the external intercostal muscles and muscles of the diaphragm relax, and the internal intercostal muscles contract. As a result, the ribs, sternum, diaphragm return to their original position. This causes a decrease in volume of the thoracic and pleural cavity, and the lungs causes expiration. All respiratory movements are controlled by medulla oblongata. The lungs are never completely emptied during every expiration. Some air remains in them, that is called as residual air. This residual air will mix with the freshly inspiratory air during the next inspiration. So alveolar air is always a mixture of used and fresh air with lower oxygen content and a higher carbon dioxide content than in the atmospheric air. So consequently, that is the oxygen taken to the blood during gas exchange will be much lesser in the mammals than in birds. Thus, mammalian lungs are less efficient than avian lungs in oxygenating the blood. So this is the structure of the rabbit respiratory system, which consists of the external cavity, larynx, trachea, bronchi, the lungs, which branches into alveoli, and the movement of the muscles which lead to expiration and inspiration.